The satellite image shows me what I already know but can't quite accept. A town laid out in perfect geometric precision. Streets crossing at right angles. Blocks of residential squares arranged with mathematical certainty. 43 buildings visible from above. Though the resolution isn't clear enough to distinguish which ones are occupied or which ones have deteriorated past habitability. I've been studying this image for 2 weeks, rotating it, zooming in on specific sectors, looking for details that might tell me something the drone footage couldn't. The town is called Mercer's Crossing, and it was abandoned officially in 1987, when the railroad that sustained it was rerouted 30 miles west. What makes it interesting to me, what made me request the assignment in the first place, is that someone is still paying the property taxes. That's not something most people would notice or care about. I only noticed because of the peculiar way I think about these things, the way I've trained myself to examine the financial infrastructure beneath places rather than their surface appearance. I work for a company called Territorial Reclamation Services, which is a somewhat grandiose name for what is essentially a surveying and cataloging operation. We identify abandoned properties across rural America, assess their condition, determine their potential value or liability, and provide that information to municipalities, developers, investors, or whoever is willing to pay for the data. It's not glamorous work, but it's methodical, and the methodology is what appeals to me. There's a logical structure to it. You go to a place, you measure things, you document what you find, and you return to your office and you compile the information into a report. The world becomes data, and data is something I understand. My name is Richard Caulfield, and I've been doing this job for 9 years. I'm 42 years old, unmarried, and I live in the same apartment I moved into when I took the position, a 1-bedroom unit in a town called Weidman that serves as our regional office. I commute to abandoned places, and I come home and I process what I found. The rhythm of this work has shaped my life in ways I'm not entirely sure I appreciate. I've become someone who can spend weeks in a deteriorating building without experiencing what most people would describe as fear or discomfort. I'm comfortable with absence. I'm comfortable with the evidence of human habitation that has been left behind, the clothes and closets, in the dishes and sinks, the photographs on walls. These things don't disturb me the way they might disturb other people. They're just data points, evidence of what was. The assignment to Mercer's Crossing came to me from a developer named Patricia Hines, who had purchased the entire town, or at least most of it, from whatever municipal entity still held nominal authority over it. She wanted a complete survey, building by building, room by room. She wanted to know which structures were salvageable, which ones were too deteriorated to bother with, which ones might have any kind of historical or architectural value. She also wanted to know about any occupation, any signs of habitation or use. This was a routine request, the kind I received 2 or 3 times a year. Or Patricia had purchased the town for what she described as a mixed-use development project, which I understood to mean she was going to demolish most of it and build something else, something more economically viable. I drove to Mercer's Crossing on a Monday in early March, about 3 weeks before the satellite image bothering me. The drive took me north and then west through increasingly rural landscape, past towns that weren't quite abandoned, but that definitely weren't thriving. The regional decline in rural America is something I see patterns in constantly. Population moves toward cities, Economic activity concentrates in centers of density, and the places in between gradually empty out. Most of the small towns I survey follow a predictable trajectory, where the first businesses to close are usually the non-essential ones: the movie theater, the luxury retailers, the restaurants that aren't part of a chain. Then the population begins to decline as younger people leave. Then infrastructure starts to fail because there aren't enough people to support the tax base. Then eventually you reach a point where the place becomes uneconomical to maintain, and if there isn't some specific resource or quality that keeps drawing people, it effectively ceases to exist. Mercer's Crossing seemed to be following this pattern exactly, except for the detail of the property taxes. The approach to the town is gradual. The rural landscape gives way to scattered buildings, a small commercial zone, and then the main grid of residential blocks. The buildings that form the entry to the town are mostly commercial, and they're in various states of decay. There's a gas station with pumps that are probably decades old, a small diner with its windows boarded over, what looks like a hardware store or general store with most of its signage missing. I parked my truck near what appeared to be the town center, a small plaza area with a defunct fountain and some wooden benches that had weathered into gray. The population of Mercer's Crossing at its peak, according to the historical records Patricia had provided, was approximately 430 people. The last census count, from some time in the 1980s, showed it had already declined to around 200. By 1987, when the railroad was rerouted, the decision was made to relocate the entire town. Not abandon it exactly, but systematically move the population elsewhere. And what remained was the physical structure of a place that had lost its reason for existing. I took my initial survey equipment from the truck and began a preliminary walkthrough of the town, the kind of initial assessment I always do before diving into detailed documentation. I was looking for a sense of the layout, for obvious hazards, for anything that might be immediately notable. The weather was cold but not uncomfortable, and the sky was a consistent gray. The streets were empty, entirely empty, in the way that only an abandoned place can be empty. There's a particular quality to that emptiness, a weight to it. It's not the absence of people as much as it's the absence of the possibility of people. The sense that the infrastructure for human habitation is still present, but is no longer being used for its intended purpose. Cars passed by occasionally on the highway that ran parallel to the town, just far enough away that I could hear the sound without seeing the vehicles. It made me aware of the distance between where I was and where the world was still functioning. There are 43 buildings in Mercer's Crossing. I counted them as I walked, though I already had a number from the preliminary research. What I was doing during this walk was getting a tactile sense of their distribution, their relationship to each other, their relative condition. The town is laid out in a grid, as I mentioned, with numbered avenues running north and south and numbered streets running east and west. The residential blocks contain mostly single-family homes, modest houses from various eras, ranging from Victorian structures that were probably built at the town's founding to more modest ranch-style homes from the 1950s and 60s. The commercial district occupies approximately 6 blocks around what would have been the downtown area, with the railroad tracks running parallel to the main avenue on the western edge. The school building is a substantial structure, probably built in the 1920s or 30s, with multiple additions that suggest it was expanded as the population grew. The whole thing has a kind of frozen quality, as if someone had decided at a specific point in time that the town was going to be preserved exactly as it was, suspended in the moment of its abandonment. After that initial walk, I checked into the motel I'd arranged for the duration of my survey. There's always a motel or a bed and breakfast nearby, in some kind of accommodation for people who need to stay in or near these places. This one was called the Mercer's Crossing Motor Lodge, which I found somewhat darkly amusing. It had been a small highway motel, 15 or 20 units arranged in an L shape around a parking lot. The owner was a woman named Mrs. Yates, who lived in a small apartment attached to the office. She was in her 70s, I would estimate, with the kind of weathered appearance that comes from spending a long life in rural areas with little sun protection or significant wealth. She was the motel owner and also the nearest full-time resident to the abandoned town. She told me she stayed in the motel because she had owned it for 40 years and she couldn't imagine leaving, even though most of her business now came from people like me, your survey people, and the occasional curious tourist who wandered through looking for photographs or some kind of experience they couldn't quite articulate. I spent my first evening at the motel, in my room, compiling preliminary data. I created a spreadsheet with the address of each building, the type of building, the approximate date of construction based on visual inspection, and the apparent condition. I marked which buildings I would prioritize for detailed survey, which ones I would approach with caution, which ones I might be able to assess from the exterior if their interiors appeared to be too unsafe. This work was calming in a way that most things aren't. The process of categorization, of taking something complex and breaking it into manageable pieces, felt like a form of understanding. By the time I finished, it was late evening, and I had a clear plan for the next several days. The next morning, I began the detailed survey in earnest. I started with the commercial buildings, both because they occupied a smaller area and because I wanted to establish a baseline for the kind of deterioration I should expect before moving into residential areas. The diner I had noticed on my first drive through the town was the first commercial building I examined. It was boarded over as I had observed, but the boards were not recent. They were weathered and partially compromised, and I was able to look through some of the gaps to see the interior. There was a service counter, booths along the windows, a kitchen visible through a pass-through window. Everything was covered in dust and the detritus of time. There were no signs of recent activity. It's just the building had been closed for probably at least 10 years, maybe longer. I took photographs and measurements and moved on. This process repeated throughout the commercial district. Gas station, mostly empty except for the pumps and some old oil cans and tools. A small bank building with its vault still visible through the glass door. A hardware store with shelves that still held some stock, though what remained was mostly rusted or decayed to the point of uselessness. A post office with mailboxes still mounted on the exterior. A church building, small and wooden, with hymn books still visible on the pews through the window. None of it was occupied. All of it bore the evidence of a systematic departure, a place that had been simply left, rather than actively destroyed or salvaged. By the afternoon of the first day, HUI had documented approximately 15 buildings and had a clear understanding of the pattern. This was an abandoned place, and it was empty. The residential survey began on the second day. I worked methodically through the blocks, going street by street. I would approach a house, assess its structural integrity from the exterior, check whether the doors and windows were accessible, and then attempt entry if it seemed safe. The interior surveys were where the emotional texture of the work became apparent. The part where the abstraction of abandoned property became personal. Inside the houses, you could see the remains of lives. There were dishes and cabinets, furniture arranged as if people might return at any moment, photographs on mantels, clothes in drawers. In one house, I found a table set for a meal, and 2 plates and 2 cups arranged as if someone had sat down to eat and then never come back. In another, there was a fully made bed with sheets that had deteriorated to the point of fragility. In a third, there was a collection of children's toys arranged on shelves, dolls and toy cars and blocks, all waiting for hands that were never going to pick them up again. This is where I should note something about myself that's relevant to the experience I'm about to describe. I have a habit when I'm conducting these surveys of creating narratives about the people I'm observing evidence of. Not in a creative or imaginative way, but in a detective-like way. I see evidence and I construct the most logical explanation for what I'm seeing. A coat hung up suggests someone left in a particular season. Photographs on a wall tell me something about family structure and values. The presence or absence of certain items suggests economic status and lifestyle choices. I'm not making these narratives up exactly. I'm assembling them from data points. But the effect is that the empty buildings become populated by my constructed images of the people who lived there. It's a habit that my previous therapist suggested might not be entirely psychologically healthy, but it's a habit I've never managed to break. It's simply how I process these places. By the end of the first week, I had surveyed approximately half the buildings in Mercer's Crossing. The town was proving to be relatively uniform in its abandonment. There was slight variation in how quickly the buildings had deteriorated, depending on factors like weathering and structural integrity, but no variation in the fundamental state of vacancy. Every building I entered was empty. Every building showed signs of having been occupied and then having been departed from, and then having been left untouched for years. There was no evidence of vandalism or theft. Doors were locked, which suggested that someone was maintaining some level of security around the property, even if the buildings themselves were no longer used. This correlated with what I knew about Patricia Hines' ownership. As soon as she had purchased the property, she had apparently secured it in some way, making sure that people couldn't simply wander in. It was on the 8th day of my survey that I encountered the first real anomaly. I had been working through a section of residential blocks on the northeast side of the town, documenting a series of small houses that appeared to be from the 1960s. These houses were generally in decent condition, their siding intact, their windows still functional, no obvious signs of structural failure. The house in question was on the corner of 7th Avenue and 12th Street, a modest single-story ranch home, painted a faded green that had weathered to a pale, almost gray-green color. It was the kind of house you see in old photographs from the suburban expansion era, representative of a particular moment when building standards and aesthetic preferences aligned in a specific way. The windows were intact, the door was still in place. There was nothing obviously different about it compared to the dozens of other houses I had already surveyed. But when I approached the front door, I noticed that it was not locked. The deadbolt was in the unlocked position, and when I turned the handle, the door opened easily. This was unusual. As I mentioned, Patricia Hines had secured the property, and I had found every other building to be locked, or at least inaccessible. I pushed the door open carefully, aware that the threshold might be unstable, and I called out to make sure I wasn't surprising anyone who might have been inside. There was no response, and I stepped into the house. The interior was dark, the windows covered with curtains or shades that prevented most of the exterior light from entering. I used my flashlight to navigate, sweeping the beam across the front room. What I saw was unusual enough that I paused for a moment to process it. The front room was furnished. Not just furnished with the leftover furniture from when people had lived there, but actively furnished, with furniture that appeared to be relatively recent. There was a sofa that looked like it had been purchased sometime in the last decade, a television set, a coffee table, a bookshelf with books. The books seemed particularly odd to me, because books are heavy and relatively valuable items, the kind of thing you would expect someone to take with them if they were abandoning a place. But here they were, arranged on the shelf, a collection of paperback novels and some nonfiction. I picked one up and checked the publication date. It was from 2015. That was 5 years ago, if my mental math was correct. The book was relatively recent relative to the abandonment of the town. I moved further into the house, and I found the same pattern continuing. The kitchen was cleaned and organized. The refrigerator, or just when I opened it, was empty and unplugged, but it was clean. The stove was dust-free. The furniture throughout the house was relatively modern and well-maintained. But there were no people. The house was completely empty of occupants. This presented a puzzle that I needed to resolve. Either someone had maintained this house as a kind of habitation space, despite the overall abandonment of the town, or someone had recently moved in and then recently moved out. The question of which explanation was correct felt important. I documented this house very carefully. I photographed every room, measured the dimensions, noted the specific contents. I took the books off the shelf and recorded their publication information. I examined the kitchen for any sign of when it had last been used. There were no dirty dishes, no stale food. It's no indication of recent cooking. But the absence of decay also suggested that the space hadn't been abandoned long ago. The dust level was minimal. The smell was not the smell of abandoned houses, which is a particular odor, a combination of moisture and mold and the slow decomposition of materials. This house smelled like a place that had simply been temporarily vacated, the kind of place where someone might have been living and then stopped living without there being any clear explanation for why. I spent most of the afternoon in and around this house, trying to determine if there were any definitive clues about who had been here or when they had left. I found personal effects scattered throughout. There was a toothbrush in the bathroom, a relatively new one. There was a blanket on the bed in one of the bedrooms, folded but not packed away. There were clothes in the closet, a woman's clothing by the appearance of them, in various sizes suggesting a range of different times in someone's life. There was a pair of shoes, women's shoes, placed under a chair in the bedroom. But there were no identifying documents, no photographs, no mail, no Anything that would tell me who this woman was or what she was doing living in one of the houses in abandoned Mercer's Crossing. I made the decision to contact Patricia Hines. I drove back to the motel, went to the office where I had a signal, and called her number. She answered on the second ring, and I explained what I had found. I described the house, the furniture, the recent maintenance, the absence of any clear indication of who had been living there. She was quiet for a moment after I finished, and then she asked me which house it was, and I told her the address. She said that she didn't know about anyone living in the house, that as far as she knew, the property was entirely secured and unoccupied. She asked me if there were any signs of break-in, any evidence that someone had forced entry. I said that there were no obvious signs of that the house had been opened with a key or with the lock in the unlocked position. There was silence on the line, and then Patricia asked me if I had checked the other buildings thoroughly, if it was possible that someone had been living in one of the other houses, and I had simply missed them. I said that it was possible, but unlikely, that I was trained to identify signs of habitation, and that I had found no such signs in any of the other structures. Can I also mention that the specific house I'd found appeared to have been intentionally furnished and maintained, which was different from the other houses, which simply had the furnishings that had been left behind at the time of abandonment. Patricia asked me if I could provide her with a full report about the house with photographs and details. I said that I would include it in my comprehensive survey report. She also asked me, somewhat carefully, if I had attempted to determine how long the house had been occupied or furnished. I said that based on the dust level and the condition of the materials, I would estimate the furniture had been there for somewhere between 5 months and 2 years. But that was a rough estimate. She asked me to be more thorough in my documentation of that house and to make it my priority for the next few days. After I hung up, I sat in the motel office and thought about what I'd found. My professional hypothesis was that Patricia Hines either didn't know about the house or she was being evasive about it for some reason. There was also the possibility that she genuinely didn't know, that someone else had been using the property without her knowledge. But that seemed less likely. If the property was supposed to be secured, and if only Patricia and her representatives had keys, then how would someone else have gotten in? I was troubled by the gap between what I had been told about the property's security and what I'd found when I actually surveyed it. The next day, I began a more thorough survey of the buildings I'd already examined, looking more carefully for signs of habitation that I might have missed. I was more careful about checking for dust patterns that might indicate something had been recently moved, for signs of recent food consumption, for anything that suggested use rather than simple abandonment. What I found, to my mild surprise, was that the house on 7th and 12th was not the only building showing signs of recent use. In a small building that appeared to be some kind of commercial space, possibly a supply store or stock room, I found evidence of food having been stored. There were shelves that had been cleared recently, leaving different dust patterns that suggested items had been removed within the last few weeks. In another house, on the opposite side of the town, I found a bedroom where the dust patterns suggested someone had been sleeping there. The specific outline of a body on the mattress where dust had been undisturbed except where contact with the surface had occurred. This was beginning to form a pattern that didn't fit the simple narrative of an abandoned town. Someone, or perhaps multiple people, had been using these buildings. Not permanently, perhaps, but with enough regularity that maintenance was being performed, furniture was being stored, the buildings were being kept in a state of readiness, as if people were going to return to use them. I spent that evening in my motel room, thinking about what this could mean. The simplest explanation was that Patricia Hines had been using the buildings as storage space or for some other purpose that she hadn't disclosed to me. But there was also the possibility that someone else was using them, someone who had access to the buildings without my knowledge. I made the decision to return to the house on 7th and 12th and attempt to determine more precisely when it had last been occupied. I had brought with me some basic equipment for dating materials, and I thought that if I could determine the age of the dust layer or the condition of perishable materials, I might be able to establish a more precise timeline. When I arrived at the house the next morning, something was different. The door was locked. I had left it unlocked, or at least I'd found it unlocked, and I hadn't locked it behind me. But now it was definitely locked, the deadbolt in the locked position. This was the moment where I should have felt alarm, where I should have recognized that something was actually wrong. But what I felt instead was a kind of puzzle-solving interest. Someone had locked the door, which meant someone had been there since I had left, or someone had been there the whole time and had noticed me leaving. I went back to my truck and got my lock-picking tools, which I carried for situations where I needed to enter buildings but didn't have keys. I returned to the door and opened it. As soon as I was inside, I knew something else was different. The house was not in the same condition I had left it in. Someone had moved through it looking for something, and they had not been careful about covering their tracks. Drawers in the kitchen were open. Books on the shelf had been partially removed and replaced. The furniture had been slightly rearranged. I spent the next several hours documenting this state. I took photographs of everything I found. I did my best to reconstruct what had been searched and what had been disturbed. What became clear was that someone was looking for something specific, something they probably believed was in this house. They had been systematic about their search, going through drawers and shelves and under furniture. But they hadn't been destructive, which suggested they didn't want to damage the house or announce that they had been there. The search had been conducted as if the searcher hoped to leave no evidence of their presence, but had also been in enough of a hurry that they hadn't fully succeeded in covering their tracks. I called Patricia Hines again. I explained what I'd found. I told her that someone had accessed this house while I was there. That someone had conducted a search of the interior. I told her that the door had been locked when I returned, which meant someone had a key, or someone had locked it behind themselves after searching. There was a long silence on the line. When Patricia spoke again, her voice had changed. It was quieter, and it had a quality I would describe as controlled concern. She asked me whether I had touched anything in the house, whether I had moved anything or removed anything. I said that I had been careful not to disturb things more than necessary for my documentation. She asked me if I could continue my survey work, but avoid that specific house and the surrounding buildings, at least for the next week. She said that something unexpected had come up regarding the property, and she needed time to address it before I continued my detailed work in that area. I agreed to her request, though I was now genuinely curious about what was happening at this property. The rational explanation was that Patricia Hines had some kind of business going on that she hadn't disclosed to me, and that business required access to the buildings. It was possible that the buildings were being used for storage, or for meetings, or for some kind of activity that she wanted to keep discreet. It was also possible that she was being completely honest about not knowing who was accessing them, in which case there was some kind of security breach at the property. But either way, continuing to work while she resolved the situation seemed reasonable. I spent the next week surveying the western half of the town, away from the area Patricia had asked me to avoid. I documented buildings methodically, took photographs, measured spaces, recorded the contents and conditions. I maintained my professional distance from the work, attempting to treat it as pure data collection rather than allowing my curiosity about the locked house and the search to influence my thinking. But the truth was that I was thinking about it constantly. I was constructing narratives about what might be happening, about why someone would be searching for something in an abandoned town, about what kind of activity would require the kind of security that seemed to be surrounding this property. By the end of that week, I had completed my survey of approximately 38 of the 43 buildings. Patricia had asked me to avoid the area around the house on 7th and 12th. And I had done so. I had also, on my own initiative, avoided surveying a few of the other buildings where I had found signs of recent use. I wasn't sure why I was avoiding them exactly. I wasn't attempting to protect myself from anything or anyone. I think, in retrospect, I was avoiding them because I sensed that there was something I didn't want to find, some piece of information that, if I discovered it, would require me to address the discrepancy between what Patricia had told me about the property and what I was actually finding. On Friday of that week, I returned to the motel to find that I had a visitor. She was waiting in the office, sitting in one of the chairs that faced the television. She was a woman in her mid-40s with short brown hair and a kind of tense attentiveness to her posture. Mrs. Yates, the motel owner, was looking somewhat uncomfortable, as if this woman's presence was unusual or troubling. When she saw me enter the office, the woman stood up and introduced herself. Her name was Susan Chen, and she said she was an investigator with a state agency that dealt with abandoned properties and development issues. She asked me if we could speak in a more private location, and I brought her to my room. In my room, Susan Chen explained that she was investigating a series of disappearances that had occurred over the past few years, and that she had evidence suggesting that at least some of those disappearances might be connected to Mercer's Crossing. She didn't provide me with specific details about the disappearances or about what the connection might be. She said that her investigation was ongoing and that she couldn't share complete information. But she said that she was particularly interested in what I had been finding during my survey and whether I had noticed anything unusual about the property beyond what I had reported to Patricia Hines. I told her about the house on 7th and 12th, about the signs of recent habitation, about the search that had been conducted while I was there. She listened carefully and took notes. When I finished, she asked me if I would be willing to cooperate with her investigation, to continue my survey work, but to pay particular attention to anything that seemed out of place, and to report my findings to her as well as to Patricia Hines. I was cautious about making such a commitment without understanding what I was committing to. I asked Susan what kind of connection she suspected between the disappeared people and the property. She said that she couldn't go into details, but that the connection seemed to involve the town itself in some way, and that she was attempting to determine whether there was any kind of ongoing illegal activity at the location. She said that if I cooperated, she would ensure that any information I provided would be kept confidential and would not be disclosed to Patricia Hines. She also said that she would pay me a consulting fee for my cooperation. This seemed like a very reasonable arrangement, and I agreed. After Susan Chen left, I spent the evening thinking about what this all meant. The state investigators' involvement suggested that something criminal or officially concerning was happening at the property. And the mention of disappeared people was troubling, though she had been vague about the specifics. What was becoming clear was that the property was being used for something more significant than simply business use or discreet storage. The fact that someone had been searching the house on 7th and 12th suggested that something valuable or important was hidden there, something that Patricia Hines or someone else was looking for. The next morning, I made the decision to continue my survey, but I also made the decision to pay more careful attention to anything that might be relevant to Susan Chen's investigation. I wanted to understand what was actually happening at this property. I was operating under the assumption that I could gather information and maintain my professional neutrality, that I could be investigating for both Patricia Hines and Susan Chen simultaneously without compromising my ability to do either job properly. This assumption was probably naive, but at the time it seemed reasonable. I focused my attention on the buildings I had been avoiding, the ones that showed signs of recent use. I approached them with more scrutiny than I had applied to the other structures. What I found was a pattern that became increasingly clear the more carefully I examined it. The buildings with signs of habitation were not scattered randomly throughout the town. They formed a kind of grid, a specific pattern of occupied or semi-occupied buildings positioned throughout the town. There was the house on 7th and 12th. There was the commercial supply building I had noticed before, or there was a small apartment building that appeared to have multiple units, and at least 2 of those units showed signs of recent use. There was a warehouse-like structure on the south end of town that had been partially cleaned out recently. And there was the school building. I had surveyed the school building early in my work, and I had found it to be abandoned in the standard way, with classrooms full of old desks and storage rooms filled with materials that had been left behind. But when I returned to survey it more carefully, I noticed something I had missed before. There was a section of the building that had been locked off, a portion of the basement that was separated from the rest by a gate and a lock. The gate was substantial, made of metal, clearly installed after the school had been abandoned. I didn't have a key for it, and I attempted to look through it to see what was beyond, but the darkness made it impossible to see much detail. I called Susan Chen and told her about the locked section of the school basement. She told me to stay away from it, that it was off limits for my own safety. She said that she was working with other agencies to investigate what was in that section, and that I should not attempt to access it. I found her warning simultaneously protective and suspicious. If she already knew about that section, if she was already investigating it, then what exactly was she hoping I would find in my survey work? I asked her that directly. She said that she wanted me to identify any other areas in the town that might show signs of use or activity, and to help her develop a map of how the property was being utilized. She said that the locked section in the school was already known to her, and that she was taking steps to secure evidence that might be related to the disappearances. I complied with her instruction not to access the locked section, but I did expand my search to look for any other indications of how the town was being used. What I found was that there were subtle signs of activity distributed throughout the town in a way that suggested planning and organization. There were water lines that had been more recently accessed, pipes that showed signs of use, even though the town's main water supply was supposed to be shut down. There were electrical connections that appeared to be relatively recent. There were supplies stored in certain buildings, food items that were relatively fresh, tools that seemed to be in current use. The town, I realized, was not actually abandoned. It was being actively maintained and used, but in a way that was designed to appear abandoned when viewed from a casual distance. This is the point where my sense of what was happening began to shift from puzzlement into something more akin to unease. I had been approaching this situation as an intellectual puzzle, something to be solved through observation and analysis. But as the pattern became clearer, as I began to understand that there was an active operation happening at this location, I started to feel the weight of that understanding. Whatever was happening at Mercer's Crossing, it was significant enough that a state investigator was involved. It was significant enough that someone had searched the house on 7th and 12th looking for something. It was significant enough that Patricia Hines had attempted to prevent me from surveying certain areas. The next time I spoke with Susan Chen, I was more direct in my questions. I asked her what had happened to the disappeared people. I asked her if she believed they were dead or alive. I asked her what connection the town had to their disappearance. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said that she couldn't provide me with details that would compromise her investigation. But she said that she appreciated my cooperation and that the information I was providing was helpful. She also said, with a tone of finality, that I should consider carefully whether I wanted to remain at the property, whether it might not be better for my own safety if I simply completed a basic survey report and left. That warning, more than anything else, made me understand that I was in a situation that was more serious than I'd initially grasped. I had been viewing this as a professional assignment, something I was being paid to do, and I'd been willing to gather information for two different parties because it seemed like I could maintain professional neutrality. But Susan Chen's warning suggested that there was danger at the location, that my personal safety was at risk, and that continuing to work there might not be advisable. I spent that night awake in my motel room, thinking about whether I should stay or leave. The practical part of my thinking said that I should leave. There was clearly something serious happening at this location, something that involved law enforcement and missing people. My job was not worth that risk. But there was another part of my thinking, the part that has always driven my work, the part that needs to understand how things fit together, that said I needed to stay, needed to complete the survey, needed to understand what was happening. By morning, I had decided to stay, but I'd also decided to be much more careful about how I moved through the town. I spent the next 2 days completing the survey of the remaining buildings. I attempted to be systematic and thorough, but I was also more alert to my surroundings, more aware of whether I was being observed, more careful about staying in populated areas or keeping my movements visible. I didn't feel like I was in immediate danger exactly, but I did feel like I was moving through a situation where something significant was at stake. It was on the morning of the 13th day that I encountered the woman. She was standing on the front porch of the house on 8th Avenue and 14th Street, a building that I'd surveyed and found to be unremarkable except for a few signs of recent cleaning. She was the woman whose clothing I had found in the house on 7th and 12th, or at least she appeared to be, based on the clothing items I had documented. She was in her mid-30s with dark hair, and she was watching me approach with an expression that was difficult to read. I stopped about 10 feet away from her and we regarded each other in silence for a moment. Then she asked me what I was doing in the town. I told her that I was conducting a survey of the buildings for a developer who had purchased the property. She asked me who the developer was, and I told her it was Patricia Hines. At that, something changed in her expression. It became harder, less open. She asked me what I had found during my survey, whether I had found anything unusual. I was cautious about how I answered. I told her that I was documenting the condition and contents of the buildings as part of my professional assignment. She asked me if I had found the house with the furniture, and I asked her how she knew about that. She said that she knew about it because it was her house, or at least it was the house that had been assigned to her. I was confused by this answer. I asked her what she meant by assigned. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said that she couldn't explain fully, but that she would tell me something that might be useful. She said that the town was not abandoned. She said that it was being used for something and that I should leave immediately and should not continue my survey. She said that if I continued, I might find things that would make me unsafe, that there were people in the town who did not want to be observed or surveyed. She said that the state investigator I had been speaking with was working on something, but that she wasn't sure how much that investigator actually understood about what was happening here. I asked her who she was and what her role was in whatever was happening at the town. She said that her name was Margaret and that she had been living in the town for approximately 3 years. She said that she had been brought here under false pretenses, that she had thought she was coming to work on a community restoration project, but that she had found herself unable to leave. She said that there were other people in the town living in various buildings, and that none of them were here entirely of their own volition. I asked her what prevented her from leaving. She said that it was complicated, that there were people here who ensured that people who lived here didn't leave, but that the control was more psychological than physical. She said that most of the people had adapted to their situation, had accepted it, and no longer tried to leave. This was the moment where everything shifted for me. The puzzle that I had been trying to solve, the pattern of building use and activity, suddenly became something much darker. The disappeared people that Susan Chen had been investigating were not dead, or at least not necessarily dead. They were here in the town, trapped in some kind of situation that they couldn't escape from. And the buildings that showed signs of recent use were not being used for business or storage. They were being used to house people who were being held against their will. I asked Margaret what she wanted me to do with this information. She said that she wanted me to leave the town and to report what I knew to someone who could actually do something about it, someone who could help. She said that the state investigator was competent, but that she was working within legal constraints that made it difficult for her to act. She said that if I left and provided a full account of what I'd found, it would give the authorities the leverage they needed to move more aggressively. I asked her if she would be safe if I left and reported what I knew. She said that she didn't know, but that continuing the cover-up would definitely not be safe for her or for the other people in the town. I told her that I would do what she asked, that I would leave that day and report everything to Susan Chen and to the authorities. She seemed relieved by this, though there was also a kind of resignation in her expression, as if she had accepted that her situation might not be resolved for a long time, even if the authorities were able to intervene. I asked her for more information about the operation, how many people were in the town, how they were being controlled, what the purpose of keeping them here was. She said that she couldn't provide those details, that she was taking a significant risk simply by speaking to me, and that she wanted to minimize the amount of information she was disclosing. Or she said that what she had told me was enough for the authorities to understand that something was seriously wrong at the property. I left her standing on the porch of the house on 8th and 14th and drove back to the motel. I immediately called Susan Chen and told her that I needed to meet with her urgently, that I had information relevant to her investigation. She said that she was in the area and that she would come to the motel immediately. When she arrived, I told her about Margaret, about what Margaret had told me about being held in the town, about there being other people in similar situations. Susan listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that I still don't entirely understand. She said that what I was describing was consistent with what she had suspected, but that she had been waiting for more direct evidence before moving forward with an official investigation at the property. She said that my encounter with Margaret changed the situation, that she now had a source she could work with to move more aggressively. She said that she would make arrangements to extract Margaret from the property, to get her to safety, and to use her testimony as the basis for a larger intervention. I asked her if the disappearances I'd heard about initially were connected to this situation. Susan said that there had been 17 people reported missing over the past 7 years, and that she had evidence suggesting that at least 12 of them might be at the property. She said that some of the cases had been closed because there was no evidence of foul play. Yes, but she had remained convinced that something criminal was happening. She said that my survey work, combined with Margaret's testimony, would finally give her the evidence she needed to move forward. I asked her what I should do next. Susan said that I should complete my survey work, that I should maintain my normal routine, and that I should act as if nothing had changed. She said that her team would be moving in within the next few days to take action, and that my continued presence and apparent normalcy would help prevent anyone at the property from becoming suspicious. She said that once her team moved in, I would be asked to leave immediately and to not discuss what had happened with anyone. I agreed to cooperate, though I was becoming increasingly uncertain about the decision to have stayed at this location. Over the next 3 days, I completed my survey work, documenting the remaining few buildings, compiling all of my data and observations into a comprehensive report. I moved through the town as if nothing had changed, maintaining my professional demeanor, recording information, taking photographs. But I was acutely aware that there were people hidden in this town, that I was walking past buildings where people were being held, that some kind of intervention was coming. On the morning of the 4th day, I was preparing to leave the town when I heard the sound of multiple vehicles arriving. I looked out the window of my motel room and saw law enforcement vehicles, state police cars, and vehicles I didn't recognize probably from whatever federal agency was assisting with the intervention. Nights there were officers in tactical gear moving into the town. I watched from a distance as they moved systematically through the buildings, conducting what appeared to be a coordinated search. Susan Chen came to the motel office and found me. She told me that I needed to leave immediately, that the property was now a crime scene and I couldn't be present. I gathered my equipment and drove away from Mercer's Crossing, leaving behind the half-completed survey, leaving behind all of the documentation I had been compiling, leaving behind the mystery that I had been trying to solve. In the weeks that followed, I received very little information about what had happened at the property. There were news reports about a rescue operation at an abandoned town, about missing people being found, about arrests being made. And the reports didn't name Mercer's Crossing directly. They referred to it as a rural property in the state. But I understood that this was the place I'd been surveying. I was not contacted by any law enforcement agencies asking for my cooperation or my testimony, which suggested that Susan Chen's work had provided sufficient evidence to move forward without needing to rely on my information. I was paid for my work, my full survey fee, plus a consulting bonus from Susan Chen, though she provided no explanation for the bonus. What troubles me now, months later, is that I don't actually know what was happening at that property. I know that people were being held there, that they were unable to leave, that the situation had attracted the attention of law enforcement, but I don't know what the purpose of the operation was. Asks what the people were being held for, what kind of control was being exerted over them. I don't know whether Margaret was successfully extracted or what happened to her subsequently. I don't know the details of the arrests or the prosecutions. I don't know what ultimately became of the property or whether it's being used for anything currently. The last piece of information I received was from Mrs. Yates, the motel owner, who called me several months after I'd left. She said that the property was being transferred to a state authority, that the buildings were being preserved as evidence, that the motel was going to close. She said that she had decided to retire and move to be closer to her children. She said that she had always suspected something was wrong with the property, that she had lived there long enough to notice when the rhythm of the town changed, when people started moving into buildings that had been empty. But she said that she had never been quite certain enough to report her suspicions to anyone. She said that when the law enforcement arrived, she understood that her suspicions had been correct. I have not returned to Mercer's Crossing. I have continued working in my position at Territorial Reclamation Services, surveying other abandoned properties, cataloging the slow decay of rural America. I have become more cautious in my approach to survey work, more willing to accept the information as simply data, less interested in constructing narratives about the people who used to live in these places. The habit I have is still there. The tendency to create stories from evidence. But I have learned to keep those stories to myself, to not let them shape my understanding in ways that might be dangerous. What stays with me, what I find myself returning to in the quieter moments of my life, is the question of how many other places are like Mercer's Crossing. How many other abandoned towns might contain secrets that are being carefully hidden from view? I have surveyed 14 other properties since then, and I find myself examining each one with the knowledge that the surface appearance of abandonment might be exactly that, a surface, and that something entirely different might be happening beneath the appearance of decay. I have never found anything approaching what I found at Mercer's Crossing, but the possibility that I might find it again, the knowledge that such situations exist and are being perpetuated, not has changed how I move through my work and how I understand the landscape of abandoned places I survey. I have also found myself thinking about what Margaret said about the control being more psychological than physical. There's something deeply unsettling about that explanation. The idea that people can be trapped, not by walls or locks, but by something internal, by patterns of thinking and acceptance that become so ingrained that they feel natural. I see that mechanism in myself sometimes, the way I have accepted that I will never know the complete truth about what happened at that property, the way I have rationalized not pushing harder for answers, the way I have maintained my professional relationships with people who were probably involved in something criminal. I wonder whether I'm trapped in a similar way, like whether the appearance of normalcy and routine in my life is actually a form of captivity that I'm not quite aware of. The last time I surveyed a property, a small town called Havensfield in the western part of the state, I found a building that was occupied. It was a brick structure that had been a kind of office or administrative building in its previous life, and it was the only building in the town that showed signs of current use. I reported it to my supervisor and to the property owner, a land trust that had purchased the town for preservation purposes. They said that they were aware of the occupation, that they had given permission for someone to use the building as a kind of caretaker residence while they determined what to do with the property. I accepted this explanation and I documented it in my report and I moved on. But I kept thinking about that occupied building after I left the property. I kept wondering whether what I had been told was actually true, whether the person living there was truly there of their own volition, whether the situation was as straightforward as it had been presented to me. And I realized that I had no way to know, that I would never know, that the ambiguity would remain with me just as the ambiguity about Mercer's Crossing remains with me. I have become someone who understands that abandoned places contain layers of meaning that are not readily visible, that the absence of people is not necessarily the absence of use, that what appears to be forgotten might actually be carefully maintained. This is the condition I find myself in now, months and months after leaving Mercer's Crossing, walking through empty buildings and empty towns, documenting evidence of human habitation that has been left behind or that is being actively hidden. I record the data, I compile the reports, I maintain my professional neutrality. But underneath the routine of my work, there is a persistent awareness that I do not fully understand what I am looking at, that the surfaces I am examining might be concealing something I'm not equipped to detect or comprehend. The grid patterns of abandoned towns have taken on a different meaning to me. They no longer simply represent the logical organization of space by people who have since departed. They have become something more like diagrams, encoded instructions for something I cannot quite read, mathematical representations of spaces that are being actively maintained for purposes I cannot quite understand. And I continue to move through these spaces, documenting their details, filing reports, telling myself that I am simply doing my job. But I wonder sometimes, in the moments between sleeping and waking, whether I was really evacuated from Mercer's Crossing at all, or whether I simply accepted the appearance of evacuation while remaining part of something much larger than I fully comprehend.